Have you ever felt like something was watching you from the shadows of a forest trail? That prickly sensation on the back of your neck when you're miles from civilization? Well, what I'm about to share with you might make you think twice before your next solo hike. These aren't urban legends or campfire stories passed down through generations. These are real accounts from real people who experienced something truly terrifying on what should have been peaceful walks in nature. I've spent months researching and verifying these encounters, reaching out to witnesses, cross-referencing reports, and piecing together the most chilling hiking experiences ever documented. What makes these stories so unsettling isn't just what happened, but how they remind us that when we step into the wilderness, we're entering a world where the rules we know simply don't apply. Before we dive into these spine-chilling tales, I need to warn you. Some of these stories contain elements that might disturb you, especially if you're planning a hiking trip anytime soon. But if you're brave enough to continue, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore 5 terrifyingly true tales from hiking trails that will leave you questioning what really lurks in the depths of our forests. Our first story takes us to the Pacific Northwest, where dense forests and misty mountain trails have harbored secrets for centuries. Sarah, an experienced hiker and outdoor enthusiast, had been exploring the Olympic Peninsula for over a decade. She knew these trails like the back of her hand, which made what happened to her on a crisp October morning even more unsettling. Sarah set out early that day, planning to complete a 12-mile loop trail she'd hiked numerous times before. The weather was perfect, and the fall colors were at their peak. Everything seemed normal for the first few hours. She encountered other hikers, exchanged pleasantries, and even stopped to photograph a family of deer grazing in a meadow. But as she ventured deeper into the forest, something began to feel wrong. The usual sounds of nature seemed muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire forest. No birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no wind through the trees. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. That's when she noticed the footprints. At first, she assumed they belonged to another hiker who had passed through earlier. But as she continued following the trail, she realized these prints were walking alongside her own path, parallel but slightly off the main trail. What made her blood run cold was the realization that these footprints appeared to be matching her pace exactly. Sarah stopped walking and listened carefully. Nothing. She took a few steps forward and examined the ground more closely. The prints were definitely human, but something was off about them. They were larger than average and seemed to be pressed unusually deep into the soft forest floor, as if made by someone carrying tremendous weight or walking with unusual force. The most disturbing part came when Sarah realized that these footprints had no corresponding impressions going in the opposite direction. Whoever or whatever was making these marks was still out there, somewhere in the thick forest that surrounded her on all sides. Fighting the urge to panic, Sarah picked up her pace, hoping to reach the next trail junction where she could potentially encounter other hikers. But the parallel footprints continued, maintaining their steady rhythm beside her path. As daylight began to fade, she made the decision to cut her hike short and head back the way she came. When she finally reached her car just as darkness fell, Sarah was shaking uncontrollably. She later reported the incident to park rangers, who conducted a search of the area the next day. They found the mysterious footprints exactly where Sarah described them, but the trail ended abruptly at a steep cliff face with no way down. Whoever had been walking alongside Sarah had simply vanished. Our second tale comes from the Appalachian Mountains, where the ancient peaks hold stories that date back thousands of years. Mark, a seasoned backpacker, was 3 days into a solo camping trip along a remote section of trail when he experienced something that still haunts him years later. Mark had set up camp near a small stream, far from any established campgrounds or heavily trafficked areas. He was an experienced outdoorsman who had spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, so he wasn't easily spooked by the usual sounds of forest life. But on his second night, something was different. It started with the sound of humming. Not the drone of insects or the whistle of wind through trees, but an unmistakably human voice humming what sounded like an old folk melody. The sound seemed to be coming from across the stream, somewhere in the dense thicket of rhododendron bushes that made the forest nearly impenetrable in that area. Mark called out, thinking perhaps another camper had set up nearby and was simply enjoying an evening around their own campfire. But his calls went unanswered, and the humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so complete it made his ears ring. Hours later, as Mark was settling into his sleeping bag, the humming resumed. This time it was closer, definitely on his side of the stream. The melody was hauntingly beautiful but completely unfamiliar, with a quality that seemed to echo strangely among the trees. Mark grabbed his flashlight and unzipped his tent to investigate. The beam of his light revealed nothing but empty forest, but the humming continued, now seeming to move in a slow circle around his campsite. As Mark swept his flashlight back and forth, trying to locate the source, he realized something that made his skin crawl. The voice was humming in perfect harmony with itself, as if multiple people were creating an ethereal chorus in the darkness around him. Mark spent the rest of the night huddled in his tent, knife in hand, listening to the otherworldly melody that continued until the first light of dawn. When morning came, he packed up immediately and hiked out, cutting his trip short by 2 days. He later researched the area extensively and discovered that the region had a long history of unexplained disappearances dating back to the early 1800s. The third story brings us to the desert Southwest, where vast expanses of seemingly empty landscape can hide mysteries in plain sight. Jennifer, a photographer and nature lover, was exploring a canyon system in Utah when she stumbled upon something that defied explanation. Jennifer had been documenting the unique rock formations and desert wildlife when she noticed a narrow side canyon she had never seen before, despite having visited this area multiple times over the years. The opening was partially hidden behind a large boulder, and something about it drew her in with an almost magnetic pull. As she squeezed through the opening, Jennifer found herself in a hidden canyon that seemed completely untouched by time. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls, depicting scenes she couldn't interpret, but that filled her with an inexplicable sense of unease. The canyon floor was covered in fine sand that showed no signs of recent human activity. But what made Jennifer's heart race was what she found at the far end of the canyon. Arranged in a perfect circle were 7 backpacks, weathered and faded but still clearly visible against the red rock. They appeared to have been there for years, possibly decades, but they were arranged too precisely to have been left by chance. Jennifer approached the circle cautiously, her photographer's instincts warring with her survival instincts. Each backpack was different, representing different eras of hiking gear spanning what appeared to be several decades. Some had equipment she recognized from the 70s and 80s, while others contained more modern gear. The most disturbing discovery came when Jennifer realized that all of the backpacks still contained personal items, identification cards, photographs, journals, and other belongings that suggested their owners had simply vanished while carrying them. The names on the IDs didn't match any missing person reports she could find later, as if these people had been systematically erased from all records. Jennifer documented everything with her camera before quickly leaving the canyon. When she tried to return the next day with park authorities, the opening to the hidden canyon was gone. The boulder had shifted, or perhaps her memory was playing tricks on her. But despite hours of searching, they never found the entrance again. Our fourth tale takes us to the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, where towering evergreens create a canopy so thick that daylight barely penetrates to the forest floor. David, an amateur mycologist who spent his weekends searching for rare fungi, experienced something during one of his foraging expeditions that changed his perspective on nature forever. David had been following what appeared to be an old logging road, long since reclaimed by the forest, when he noticed an unusual cluster of mushrooms growing in a nearly perfect spiral pattern. As someone who had studied fungi for years, he knew this type of formation was extremely rare and potentially significant for his research. As he knelt down to photograph the specimens, David became aware of a subtle change in his surroundings. The forest had grown quieter, but more than that, it felt as if he was being observed. He looked up from his camera to see a figure standing about 50 yards away, partially obscured by the massive trunk of an old-growth cedar. The figure appeared to be a person, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. It was tall, much taller than any human David had ever seen, and it stood with an unnatural stillness that made his instincts scream danger. Most unsettling of all, when David tried to focus his eyes on the figure, it seemed to shift and blur, as if his mind couldn't quite process what he was seeing. David remained frozen in his crouched position, afraid that any movement might draw the attention of whatever was watching him. Minutes passed like hours as he and the figure remained locked in this silent standoff. The thing never moved, never made a sound, but David could feel its gaze like a physical weight pressing down on him. Finally, David's leg muscles began to cramp from holding the same position for so long. He had to move or risk falling over. As slowly as possible, he began to stand up, never taking his eyes off the distant figure. But as he rose to his full height, the figure began to move as well, not walking but gliding between the trees with a fluid motion that defied the laws of physics. David grabbed his equipment and ran. He crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the old logging road and heading in what he hoped was the direction of his car. Behind him, he could hear something large moving through the forest, keeping pace with his desperate flight but never quite catching up. When David finally reached his vehicle, he was bleeding from dozens of scratches and cuts from branches and thorns. He drove away immediately and didn't return to that section of forest for over a year. When he finally did go back, accompanied by several other researchers, they could never find the old logging road or the unusual mushroom formation he had been studying. Our final story comes from the Midwest, where rolling hills and seemingly harmless woodland trails hide secrets that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Lisa, a local teacher who used hiking as a way to decompress after long days in the classroom, discovered that some trails lead to places that shouldn't exist. Lisa had been following a trail she had hiked dozens of times before, a simple 3-mile loop through a state park near her home. But on this particular afternoon, something was different. The trail seemed to be extending itself, continuing far beyond where it should have ended at the parking lot. At first, Lisa thought she had simply taken a wrong turn, despite knowing the trail by heart. But as she continued walking, she realized she was still following the same familiar markers and landmarks, only they seemed to be repeating themselves in an impossible loop. She passed the same distinctive rock formation 3 times, each time expecting to see the parking lot just around the next bend. As the sun began to set, Lisa's confusion turned to genuine fear. She had been walking for hours and should have completed the loop multiple times over, yet she never seemed to make any real progress. The trail just continued endlessly, leading her through the same scenery over and over again. The most terrifying moment came when Lisa encountered herself. Not a reflection or a mirage, but an exact duplicate walking the trail in the opposite direction. The other Lisa looked just as confused and frightened as she felt, and when they tried to speak to each other, their voices seemed to echo and overlap in ways that made no sense. Lisa eventually found her way back to the parking lot just as park rangers were organizing a search party. According to them, she had been missing for over 14 hours, but Lisa's watch showed that only 3 hours had passed. The park rangers insisted there was no way to get lost on such a simple, well-marked trail, and they found no evidence of any trail extensions or alternate routes. These 5 stories represent just a fraction of the unexplained encounters that occur in our wilderness areas every year. They remind us that nature still holds mysteries we may never fully understand, and that sometimes the most terrifying experiences happen not in haunted houses or abandoned buildings, but in the places we go to find peace and solitude. Whether these encounters represent something supernatural, psychological, or simply unexplained natural phenomena, they all share common elements that make them particularly unsettling. The isolation, the vulnerability, and the stark reminder that we are not always the apex predator in these environments combine to create experiences that haunt those who live them for the rest of their lives. If you enjoyed these terrifying tales from the trails, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments if you've ever had your own unexplained encounter while hiking. And remember, the next time you're alone on a forest trail and you get that feeling that something isn't quite right, trust your instincts. Sometimes the wilderness is trying to tell you something important.